Okay, so we're going to go into Syria now. We've talked a little bit about it already, but we're going to get into it in more detail now, and I'll kind of go through how this happened. So if you could bring up the Syria slide and the first slide after that. You go, yeah, okay. So again, we're going from the Mandate period to the Assad dictatorship that is now in power. Just very quickly, we're going to go through this. So 1920, we have the Kingdom of Syria, which was founded. It didn't last very long at all. The British actually the French tried to set up a Kingdom of Syria, but it collapsed almost immediately. And the French had to go in as an occupational force. The French were there throughout this period, but there was definitely always throughout that period, there was kind of an independent movement in Syria. There was different tribes, different families trying to assert themselves as like the rulers of Syria. It never actually took hold until finally in '46 the independence happened because, again, the Brits basically told the French to leave. You've screwed this up enough, you've got to go. So that's what happened again. Again, a kind of a repeat where we had with the Lebanon thing, where we had basically the French there, but they were basically told to leave. And they left Syria at that time in real disarray. There was a constitution in place. There was basically a functioning sort of quasi-republic from 1936 on. But basically the French just pulled out. I mean, nothing was really settled when they pulled out. And they pulled out kind of reckless like that, much like how the British pulled out of the Palestinian Mandate. And immediately they got caught up in the war with Israel. They did send troops. They did actually send troops across the border into Israel. These were, many of these guys had pitchforks. So it wasn't much of an army at that time, but it did happen. But they were resoundingly defeated, and Israel was born, of course. Then in '67, they entered that war from the north, from what is now the Golan Heights. That was controlled by Syria. That had been, pre-'67, the Golan Heights had been a thorn in the side of Israel in a major way. The Golan Heights had been a place where Syrian troops could seriously shoot down on the Sea of Galilee at Israeli fishermen. And they'd do it all the time. They would take pot shots at them. And this happened constantly. It was constant harassment. There was Syrian troops ranging in that northern area of the Golan Heights. It was very much a volatile border, very unstable, very difficult for Israel to accept that was going to be the permanent status. They were constantly trying to work with the Syrian government to establish some kind of treaty there, but it never happened because no one could make a treaty with Israel. And so in '67, when this war broke out, and they could tell that Syria was actually massing and was actually going to invade down through the Golan Heights to Tiberias and try to seize Tiberias, the Israelis pushed back and actually drove, in a major tank battle, drove the Syrian army clear back away from the Golan Heights and took the elevated area there, the hillside, and pushed the Syrian forces all the way back. In fact, there were moments there when there was a decision made by the Israelis not to take Damascus, that they probably could have. They didn't know they could have. They were reading intelligence. They didn't know. It's fog of war and all that. But there was a moment there where they could have just driven right into Damascus. And that would have obviously changed history in a major way. But they didn't do that. But they took the Golan and they kept it. Because that was the heights, and they needed to protect their people from this constant harassment from the heights. So from that period of time, from '67, they controlled that. And in '70, because of the Syrian loss in the '67 war, Hafez Assad, who was the defense minister, was able to take power. He was able to kick people out of power, massacre a whole bunch of other people. And actually, throughout the late '60s and '70s, Syria was basically this succession of coups. It was one coup after another. Lots of bloody coups, things like this happening. But Hafez Assad was basically able to do this bloodlessly. He basically just kicked out a lot of people and basically came into power and just assumed control of the state. And that was in '70. And when he did that, it was already understood, and he was basically being talked into. This was also a very weird time in Arab history, when you've probably all forgotten about the United Arab Republic, and that's okay. Because everybody forgets about it because it was so short-lived. But basically, there was a moment in time in these years when when Egypt was under Nasser, where he united Syria and Egypt. They actually became one country. It only lasted 3 or 4 years, but it was called the United Arab Republic. And during that time, during that confusing time, is when a lot of this stuff happened. And in the end, with this time in the 73 war with Israel, when Egypt launched the war, that was something that really Syria was not prepared to go along with. They came in late. They actually held back. They came in 2 weeks late. They lost 2, and et cetera. So the whole thing went badly for the Arab states, even though it had been this major, not a victory for Egypt, but definitely from the Egypt perspective, they achieved what they wanted, which they showed Israel, we have a war option. Okay? That was the thinking in Egypt, that we did what we did to prove to Israel that we can take you on and that we will take you on. Syria basically just came late to the party and got beat and went home. But Egypt actually achieved some of its goals, and that's what leads to the peace treaty, and we'll get into that when we talk about Egypt. But for now, we'll just focus on this. So there was the war with Israel, and then in 76, Lebanon went into a massive convulsions of civil war. This civil war lasted for a long time because Syria basically came in and occupied Lebanon. For 30 years, Lebanon was basically occupied by Syria, and it was done to control and to protect the people, as often these occupations are done. But because of that, that whole period of time, 76 to 2005, we didn't go into much of that in the other side, in the Lebanon side, because I wanted to talk about it here. So what we have here is this time, a period when Lebanon is part of Syria. Okay, it's under the thumb of Syria, it's under the thumb of the Assad regime, and it is this time period when we see from in the late 70s, 79 and 78 in Lebanon is when we start to see the first time when we see Iran insert itself into Lebanon through Syria, using the conduit of Syria. Iran inserts itself into the Shia of Lebanon as Hezbollah. And this in 79, 80, 81, that's the first time we start to hear about this Shia group called Hezbollah. Okay? And that's when that all begins. That whole phenomenon starts. And so from 2005 is when they're finally the Syrians are forced out. And again, I'm jumping over a lot of stuff because I want to talk about what's happening in Syria now. And this is just some background. And then in 2000 is when Bashar Assad, the son of Hafez Assad, succeeds him. Now, Bashar Assad was Westernly educated. He was an eye doctor. He was British. He'd gone to England, studied there, met his wife there, and brought her back. And he was seen as this he was going to be a reformer. He was going to help change Syria to a new thing, maybe a real republic, instead of the dictatorship of his father. None of that came to pass. And from the beginning, Bashar Assad was attempting to do anything he could to change the calculation between him and Israel. He was terrified that Israel was going to take over his country. This was a little bit delusional because Israel never had any desire to do that. But there was a real terror, a real fear in Bashar Assad's thinking about Israel. He was terrified of what Israel could do to his country, and he could not respond. He could not do anything about it. And so that was a lot of his calculations. Early on, when he first took power, when everyone was still thinking he was going to be this Western reformer, he was busy working out a deal with the North Koreans to start a nuclear program. Very soon after that, he began trying to weaponize Scud missiles. He could build Scuds. He already had a Scud factory. He was trying to mount them with chemical weapons. He was also doing terrorist attacks and working with some Syrian leaders, and Hezbollah became part of his calculation. Hezbollah had grown into this now very serious terrorist organization. And so he was using Hezbollah as a conduit. He was helping supply them. He was selling them top-shelf Syrian weapons, stuff like this, which is something his father never did. So there was all kinds of things that Bashar Assad did that were very destabilizing very early on in his coming to power that the Israelis saw, but very few other people saw, because they were the ones that were going to be the immediate beneficiaries of anything he achieved. So he was desperately trying to do this, but it put him in a situation where he could never, ever, ever really deal with any of the actual problems of his people, or he chose not to. It wasn't that he didn't have a choice. He did have a choice. He could have done things to help his people, but he didn't do those things. And so what happened early in 2011, so let's go to the next slide. So, okay, we'll go through go ahead, click through all this. What happened was he created a security force in the Mukhabarat to control his people, and this would have already been there with his father. but the security apparatus of Syria was so brutal and so unfeeling and so so oppressive that eventually something had to break. And with the Arab Spring and what had happened in Egypt, and then what happened in Yemen, and this thing had started to burgeon, well, eventually it started in Syria. And the basic genesis of this, the match that lit the flame in Syria, was several children had been taken from the streets. They had been spraying anti-Assad graffiti on a wall. They were seized by Syrian security forces, thugs. They were taken and beaten to death and then given back to their parents. They were tortured and given back to their parents. The bodies were given back to their parents. In some cases, they were not even given back. Some cases, they were just, the child was just gone. This was in Dara, which is in southern Syria, and it touched off this wave of mass protests. And this continued and continued. Well, it continued long enough that Assad started responding with military force and starting to shoot at the protesters. The army fractured. A huge part of the army defected away because they would not fire on protesters. A huge part of the army, by the way, is Sunni. And Assad is not. We talked about Sunni Shia a little bit. Well, now I'm going to confuse you even more. Assad is from an Alawi sect. The Alawis are a break-off of Shiaism. They are another branch, okay? They are an ethnicity and a religion, as lots of things are over there, and they are very, very, very oppressed in other areas, in other countries. Alawis are, like the Shia, looked down on. They're seen as heretics. They're seen as not Orthodox. The Sunnis don't even acknowledge them as Muslims, okay? So, and Shia, interestingly, by and large, don't like Alawi either. But Shia Iran made a deal with Assad and sort of gave him permission to be considered kosher, if you will, halal, okay? And so this arrangement between the Assad family and Iran was a theological one at one level, that they got to be considered true Muslims, and they did the bidding of Iran when needed. And so Assad knows that he has to maintain power and control Syria because that's his arrangement with Iran. He is the conduit by which they supply Hezbollah. It goes through Syria. He also sells enormous amounts of stuff to Hezbollah and gets paid very well for that. So this is all the things that created this relationship. It was actually one of theological construct, but it was also one of financing a war, financing the Hezbollah entity in Israel, in southern Lebanon, north of Israel. So this all is part of what's happening here. So now let's look at what's going on. This thing has gone completely off the rails. Okay, whatever was going to happen in Syria, whatever theory we had in the first months of Syria, the first year of the Syria revolution, the civil war, all that's gone off the rails. We are now in a situation where Syria does not exist. Okay? There is no more Syria. Syria is now tearing itself apart. There may end up being a little rump state that the regime controls, but they will never again control all of what they controlled before. That's done. So just as we now talk about the former Yugoslavia, we'll be talking about the former Syria. And it will be pieces of what it was, lots of pieces actually, and we'll go into that. So what we have now, as you can see here, 130,000 killed. Okay, when we talk about Al-Qaeda, we talk about Israel, someone mentioned here earlier, Israel violence against the Palestinians and how many have been killed in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, et cetera, et cetera. The entire history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict involves the death of less than 10,000 people by a lot. I think it's even like 6,000. That's the entire Israel-Palestinian relationship from the beginning to today. Involves the death of maybe 6,000. I don't have the exact number. I'll get it and I'll send it to your pastor. But there's a number. It's known, and it's not that high. It's bad. Every death is bad. I'm not trying to be trivial about it. I'm saying some perspective is important. Okay? Assad has butchered, at the point of his own gun, 130,000 of his own people. And that's a low number, I guarantee you. This is what the UN has been able to confirm. And by the way, they've stopped counting because the war is so bad in some areas they can't get in there to count. So they don't know. There's been 267,000 deaths reported to the UN by people who said we witnessed it, they saw it, here's the body, etc. The body's buried here. But those can't be confirmed, so the number is 130,000. So we have 2.5 million external refugees. Again, half are children. That's how many have fled the country. We have 6 million internally displaced. By the way, this is a country of, officially, 23 million people. So you're talking 30-40% of the country is out of the country or in the country, homeless, carrying everything they own on their backs, running away from something. So it's a total calamity. It's a calamity. And the Assad regime continues to do the most horrible things. They now are barrel bombing. Their planes they've kind of run out of, they can't fly their most advanced planes because if they get shot down. Also the pilots, they're very, very rare to find good pilots in Syria right now. So what they've been doing is they've been taking their trainer planes or helicopters and flying over civilian areas and dropping barrel bombs. That they're just makeshift barrel bombs, just indiscriminately on civilian areas. Okay? This is what Assad has been doing in Aleppo recently. So this is how this thing has devolved. And it's devolving even more. But this is the base, and the chemical weapons attacks, we've had 14 chemical weapons attacks by the regime. Okay, one, the most severe one, killed 1,429 people, including 400 children. That was when the United States almost walked right up to the edge of doing airstrikes, and then backed down when they realized they could maybe get the chemical weapons out a different way, and that's where things are now. Chemical weapons are being removed. That's not a great solution, but perhaps it was better than trying to launch a war with Syria. So that was why the choice was made. Rising al-Qaeda influence, as I talked about, ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, now the al-Qaeda entity in Syria, major fighting force. 10,000, that's also probably a conservative number. It's maybe as much as 15,000 of al-Qaeda people suited up, ready to go to war for al-Qaeda in Syria to fight the regime. Again, they're fighting Assad. Keep this in mind. Al-Qaeda in Syria has declared war on Assad and Hezbollah. Al-Qaeda is against Hezbollah. It wants to destroy Hezbollah. Now, there's always a moment when you hear that, and you're kind of like, well, that sounds pretty good. But again, remember, what happens in Syria will not stay in Syria. Whoever wins this battle will be the most battle-hardened, horrifically cold-hearted terrorist organization we've ever heard of and ever seen. Whoever wins in Syria is going to inflict themselves on the world. So it's not going to end with what's happening in Syria. It will not end. Plus, the weapons proliferation of Syria is staggering, what could happen. Shoulder-mounted rocket. It's called a man-pad, man-portable air defense system. This is a very serious, dangerous weapon. Okay? The NATO coding is SA2, SA4, SA6, SA8. Okay, it goes up there every time they make a new version. They make SA something. Okay. An SA2 took out an F-16 in the Gulf War. Okay, that's like a long time ago, 1991. Okay, so these are serious weapons. What they have now, commonly in Syria on the ground, are SA-7s, SA-8s, and they have a few, Syria had a few SA-20s, SA-24s, top-shelf Russian shoulder-mounted rockets that can take out an F-16 at 20,000 feet. Okay? These things exist, a few hundred maybe, but they exist in Syria, somewhere, in a warehouse, somewhere. Okay? Now, leave off the fact that there is not a single plane except the Israelis that can actually defeat one of these things, that actually has countermeasures to defeat one of these things. Forget combat aircraft. What about commercial aircraft? Can you imagine how many terrorist organizations would want to have one of those things? So this is the type of proliferation we could see out of Syria. That's why Syria is not, it's not about let them all kill each other. Okay, that's going to happen anyway, but that's not the end of the story. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. So let's look at a little bit at this. Go to the next one. Yeah, go drop on down this, yeah. So I've talked a little bit about some of this. That whole yellow area is the area, as you see, contested area. That's where the fighting is happening. Okay? Now, if you look, the dots are a little confusing. I'll have a better map after this, but just to basically understand this, a black dot means the regime still controls that area. Red is, or like the kind of, yeah, red, not purple. The red is controlled by the Free Syrian Army. These are the defectors. Remember I talked about how the army, half the army split and defected? That still exists as an entity. That Free Syrian Army still exists. It's much smaller now. It's taken a lot of damage over the years. It's still there. It's still basically non-Islamist, okay? But it is working with Islamist groups because it has to. That's what's on the ground. That's what's there. So the Free Syrian Army exists, and those are, the red are controlled by them, or areas where they control, including a little piece of Damascus, as you see, a piece of Aleppo, as you see, stuff like that. The purple, as you see, the ISIS and al-Nusra, those are al-Qaeda. So Raqqa, Tal Abyad, this is a December map, so things have even changed since this map was made. But basically, this is where you see the al-Qaeda strength, the regime strength, and the blue is Kurdish militia. We haven't talked about the Kurds yet. The Kurds are in the north, and they're basically walling themselves off and declaring themselves a separate state. Okay, that's happening. Again, it's the different pieces of Syria just pulling themselves apart. And then on down the line. So what you have is you basically have, and I want to be very careful here, the Syrian regime is the one side of this, and they have Alawi militia that they're training people they got from the streets, and they're giving them guns and teaching them how to shoot people. And then they have Shia militia. These are being trained by Hezbollah. They're also being trained by Iranian IRGC guards. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And they're being trained by Iranian specialists, things like this, but they're being trained. They're helping the regime. So the regime is holding on, not just with its own army, which is left, which is maybe 50,000 troops left from a 300,000 size army when this started. Most of that's from defections, by the way, or attrition. The core of the army that's been with Assad from the beginning is basically still there. And then we have the rebel forces. We have al-Qaeda, as we've seen, and we have this Islamic Front. This is a new development. This happened in September. We had 50 plus Islamic groups join up into the Islamic Front as a counter to al-Qaeda. So if you're confused before, wait. So now we have an Islamic Front. These are Islamists. Many of these are jihadis. These have accepted that violence is the answer. Okay? But they also don't want al-Qaeda to take over their country. They are Syrian nationals. They're Syrian patriots, but they're Islamists. So, if you're America or the West, who do you help here? Okay? This is the problem we face. I complained about 30 million to whatever, but where do you give the money? What do you do with it? And if you give it, what happens to that? If you give these people weapons, what happens to them? If you give it to any of these little organizations, and by the way, all these Islamic Front, it's 50 to 100 different little battalions, okay? Okay, let's say you vet a group, you take them aside, you say, what is your vision for a future Syria? You sit them down, you explain all this, you say, here's what we're going to do for you, we're going to give you this money, we're going to give you some stingers, you know, whatever. We're going to give you the things you need to fight a war. Okay, we have no idea, but it's a pretty good bet that that group is going to take those 10 stingers, sit 5 in a drawer somewhere, and take the other 5 and go do what you want to do. But the other 5, that's money, that's for a rainy day, it's whatever, right? This is the thinking on the ground. And I don't blame them for thinking that way. They're in a war, okay? I'm not resentful of this. I'm just saying it colors everything we have to do as we approach these groups. There's no way to predict what is going to happen to any aid, any lethal aid we would give. It's extremely difficult. To give you an idea how crazy this is, we have a situation where Raqqa is near oil fields, okay? That was taken, so Yemeni guys from Yemen who are al-Qaeda, want to be al-Qaedas, Al-Qaeda wannabes. They come all the way there and join up in some kind of brigade, okay? And they go to Al-Raqqa and they get embraced by Al-Qaeda and they're told, okay, go take that oil field because we need the oil. So they go take the oil field. This is all true, by the way. I'm just making it like a story, but this all happened. So they go and they take this oil field and they start pumping the oil. The pump still works. They get it working. They pump the oil. Okay, now Syrian oil, Syrian crude is very dirty. It's very hard to refine. It's not good oil. There's only one market for it, and that was Europe, and that's not available. So what do you got? You have the regime, the Syrian regime that you're fighting against. They're the only ones that are going to buy that oil. They're the only ones that can do anything with it. So what do? You sell them the oil. So these guys, Al-Raqqa, Al-Qaeda, take this oil field. They take the oil. They sell it to Assad. Assad pays them. They take the money. They go back to Yemen. They buy a bunch of weapons and RPGs and shoulder-mounted rockets. They come back and they fight Assad. This is what's happening. This is how insane this is, right? And that's one example. And there's hundreds of these examples. So this is where this is going. This is why it's crazy. This is why I have a job. So then we have the Kurdish militias. I talked about them a little bit. They are just walling themselves off. They're not helping the rebels, and they're not helping the regime. They really just want to stay out of it. They're trying to carve out their own territory. They actually declared an independent state a while back. That happens every so often. We don't know any of them are real, but one day we'll probably all be talking about the Kurdish Independence Day, which was one of those days. It just depends on how long it takes to get to the point so they can have a ceremony and have their own country. But the Kurds are carving out their own territory, just like all these little the Al-Qaeda groups are carving out their little fiefdoms. Okay, so go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is kind of a clearer, it's not clearer, but it's more stark, I guess. So the green area is the area now controlled by rebel groups, and again, all different rebel groups. That's Al-Qaeda, as you saw, that's Al-Nusra, that's the Islamic Front. It's all these different groups. That's the green area. The red area is basically still controlled by the regime, or still where the regime has freedom of movement. Control is a very, very high-level term that I'm not going to use, but the regime definitely has freedom of movement in that red zone. The green zone is where the rebels have freedom of movement, and then the Kurdish area is the area in the north there where the Kurds basically have carved out this space, where they are not harassed by any of the other parties. So that's kind of formalizing. Now note, there is a part right on the northern border where the Euphrates goes into Turkey. Right there is also a Kurdish area, and then Aleppo, there's a Kurdish area north of Aleppo, northwest. And then in Aleppo itself, there's a Kurdish enclave that has basically carved itself out of the actual city and is not helping the rebels and not helping the regime. So all this is happening on this kind of scale, and it's all chaotic, and it's only getting worse. So we'll go to the next one. So this is important. Just click down through this. We kind of talked about some of this, but I want to just hit it again, just as a closing thing. This is the civil war would be over. Okay, Assad would be gone. The whole regime would have collapsed if not for Iran. Iran has kept this going. Iran has kept Assad alive. He's kept him fueled, kept him armed, kept him with bullets and stuff like this. This has been an Iranian effort from very early on. They have been all in. And we'll get into why, but the main reason why is they need this corridor. The little reason is they need the corridor to Hezbollah intact. Hezbollah must survive. It's the check against Israel and Israel striking on their nuclear program. We'll talk about that later. But that's the thing that is crucial for them, is keeping this corridor, the Syrian corridor, open. So that is why we haven't seen, it's one reason we haven't seen a major effort for the regime and Hezbollah and the Iranian effort. There's been no real Iranian effort to take Aleppo, say. Why? Because Aleppo isn't important to them. They don't need northern Syria. They need the southern part of Syria, the conduit that connects Hezbollah all the way to Tehran. That's what they care about. That's what they're willing to defend. That's what they're willing to invest in. But Aleppo, that can fend for itself. If Assad wants to try to take it back, fine. But they don't need it. So this is kind of the thinking. Iran's thinking is not Assad's thinking. It's not necessarily Hezbollah's thinking, though it's much closer to Hezbollah. But Iran's thinking is keeping that core, keeping our sphere, keeping our corridor open, that keeps us alive. Iran is terrified of not getting the nuke, because if they don't get the nuke, they think they'll collapse internally. The regime cannot survive without it. They think if they do get the nuke, if they do get the nuclear weapon, then they will survive. They will survive if they get that. They'll be untouchable. Okay, this is the core Iranian strategic thinking. Okay, so what we have here is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is very much the vanguard or the elite of the Iranian army, the Iranian forces. It's not even part of the irregular army. It's a whole separate entity. It's a whole separate thing. It is very much the ruling, if you will, I'm trying to avoid saying a class. It's not a class at all. But it is a ruling institution of Iran. And even though Khamenei is the supreme leader and the president Rouhani, they both must maintain a very good relationship and have clout and have presence and have gravitas with the IRGC in order to rule. The IRGC must be not coddled, but answered to. Okay? So the IRGC is really the ruling state, the deep state of Iran. And yes, Khamenei has tremendous power and tremendous control, but he couldn't really take action against the IRGC, nor could the president he even has less power. Rouhani even has less power, the current president of Iran. So we have Hezbollah there, we have the Iraqi Shia, we have the Syrian Alawi militia, we have the Quds Force. IRGC Quds Force is a 5,000-member branch of the Guard that is even the elite within the elite. Okay? And that legion, if you will, that major legion, Quds Force, is the one that's doing most of the work in Syria. Okay? Qassam Soleimani is the commander of that, and he is a very serious operative. He did most of the damage to the United States forces in Iraq. He was instrumental in that. He was instrumental in placing Maliki in power. He's been instrumental in a lot of things that happened in Iraq, and now he's basically running the war in Syria. So he's a very key player. You'll probably hear about him on the news at some point, but that's who he is. He is a very serious Iranian senior officer, senior general, who has full control over what's going on in Syria from the Iranian perspective. Okay? And there's about 2,000 to 4,000 of this Quds Force in Syria at any given time, but sometimes much less, sometimes maybe only a few hundred. But this fluctuates depending on what the needs are. But at any given time, there's this many actual Quds Force troops operating or training, things like that in in Syria, sorry. So go to the next. Okay, now we're going to go into Egypt. So we'll stop here and do Syria questions just real quick. Yeah. And I'll take a drink.
Hi, Barbarella Brown again. With the current disposal of Syrian weapons, how realistic is that it cannot happen again with the Iranian interests that you spoke about?
Say again, the first part of the question?
Right now, with the current disposal of the Syrian chemical weapons, how realistic is it that it will not happen again in terms of them being able to get these weapons with the Iranian interests in Syria that you spoke about?
I firmly believe, I'll speak personally here, I firmly believe that we will not get all the chemical weapons. They will hide some, they will stash some, they will put some in a warehouse. But I do think Assad played a very good game here in that he got the West to come in, take all these chemical weapons out, or the vast majority of them, and he doesn't have to pay for it. He doesn't have to secure the weapons. He just has to allow them to leave. And that keeps those weapons out of the hands of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic Front or any of his enemies, which could have overrun one of these chemical weapon sites and taken the chemical weapons for themselves. His biggest fear was that one of these rebel groups would have gotten chemical weapons and used them against him, used them against Damascus Palace or something, his palace in Damascus. I mean, that was his biggest fear. So now he's orchestrated a situation where not only does he get rid of the vast majority of these weapons, he gets them reduced down to a very small amount that he can control and hide. The rest are removed from the country, and no one can make more. And so he retains a certain level of his deterrent and a certain level of his combat ability for those chemical weapons that he's actually used in combat. And the West had to pay for it. And also, throughout this entire process, he is party to an agreement with the UN, which makes him, once again, the legitimate president of Syria, even though it's U.S. policy that he should be removed and he has no legitimacy. So he has played this very well. He has bought himself however many months it takes to do this, and he's already started to throw some sand in the gears and drag his feet on different things. And so he's played this very well. Assad is very shrewd. And also, I will say something here, too, it's a little bit of a hard thing to think about, especially coming from America and democracy and all that, but the Syrian regime does not, and this is not wholly untrue in other Arab states or Middle Eastern states, but it's particularly true with the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime never sought legitimacy from the people. The Syrian regime does not need the Syrian people to give it legitimacy. It never wanted internal sources for legitimacy. It wanted external sources. The Syrian legitimacy is granted to it by the West or by the international community. That's who declares that he is the president of Syria. We do. The people have rejected him. See? So he's in a very delicate situation, and he's managing it quite well. Now, I still feel that his regime is very brittle and could break and could collapse. But right now, he's taken, I think of him as he's a guy in a card game with a pair of fours. But he's played the hand very well, and he's still there. He's still there. So, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Kelly Scavella. I'm going to skip ahead and ask a question about Egypt because I'm not going to be able to be here to the end, so I apologize for going out of order.
No problem.
But just like you, I had the experience of being abroad. Just like you, I had the experience of being abroad and working abroad, and I was in Egypt. And I was able to work with refugees there, refugees from surrounding African countries.
Oh, wow.
And so what I'm hearing and what I see is that for some African refugees who weren't able to be sent to Australia, they tried to escape to Israel. Mm-hmm. And once they cross over like the Sinai region, they're being shot. On top of that, Israel has a fence, and as we speak, there are currently protesting going on for Africans that have made it that haven't been granted asylum. If I'm wrong in any way, please correct me, but why aren't they granted asylum? Thank you.
Yeah, so she's talking about the African refugees that have tried to get to Israel. They've tried to get other places too, and they've tried to get to Israel. It's a very, very tough situation in Israel because Israel did two major immigrations from Ethiopia at great cost to the state of literally thousands and thousands of Ethiopians who were Ethiopian Jews were brought in. And they have in the past, when the border on the Sinai was open, hundreds and hundreds of refugees poured across. In fact, at one point there was a few thousand a month were actually coming across into Israel. And these people, by the way, I want to stress, they have endured unimaginable horrors just to get to the Israeli border. And the Israelis know that. I mean, they get there and they have been through the Sinai. They've probably been tortured. They might have had other things happen. They might have escaped a camp. They've had their organs harvested sometimes. I mean, really horrific stuff has happened in the Sinai to them. But they get out, they pay all this money to the guys in the Sinai, and they finally get to the Israeli border, and they get through, and then Israel has no idea what to do with this many people coming in this way. Because it already absorbs, it already has a right of return. So any Jew in the world can come to Israel, and they receive enormous amounts of help from the government to do that. And they can come there and become a citizen of Israel. And it's very, very complex, very, it's a formula, but it's an expensive one. And Israel has maintained this from 48, and it still maintains it. So this amount of refugees coming across the border was something that Israel had a very difficult time absorbing. Secondarily, at the same time this was happening, we had terrorist attacks now in the Sinai more and more. And we had the Sinai going more and more to Islamist groups, even Al-Qaeda affiliate type groups in the Sinai. So there was this desire by Israel, and with Gaza also going into Hamas control in 2005, there was this new desire to actually build a fence along the Egyptian border with Israel. Okay? That had never been there, even with the treaty and everything, there'd never been a border there, a border fence there. But it was determined that it was just too big of a gap. And the one thing that really told the tale was when a very, very complex operation, very sophisticated operation, actually got about 6 or 9, I think it was 9 terrorists, actually came out of Sinai, got across the border and fired at a bus, and the Israelis had to respond, and there were several people killed, and there was 8 Israelis killed in the firefight and everything on the Israel side. This all happened in, I believe, 2012, 2013, I can't remember exactly. And all of that played into this idea that, okay, the border has to be sealed. And it's a very difficult, it's just as the points she raised are raised every day by Israelis, it's still debated in the Israeli media, it's still debated. We haven't figured out how best to handle this. This is kind of the Israeli perspective. This is still a problem, it's still ongoing. But there is definitely a desire to help these people. There's definitely understanding that they want to not send these people back through the Sinai, but they don't know what to do. And it's still being debated, it's still ongoing, but they also have to be able to protect that southern border from actual terrorist incursions. So it's a very complex problem for Israel. I'm sorry that's not a great answer, but that's the honest situation. It's still ongoing debate. Yeah.
My name is Evie.
Oh, yeah, we have to go on to Egypt, so, but last question.
Okay, sure. My name is Evie Isles, and I can actually wait, but does Turkey have any role in this,
Oh, yeah.
the Syria part?
I've kind of skipped Turkey because I had to kind of limit my groups, but Turkey, yes, they have 500,000 refugees. They have a relationship with Israel that's under strain right now because Erdogan, the current president of Turkey, has a real problem with Israel on various issues. So there's a lot of personal problems between Turkey at the upper level. Like Erdogan and Netanyahu just don't get along in a lot of ways. But having said that, there's a lot of shared interest in Turkey, and I think that Erdogan right now is caught in this major corruption scandal, so he may not survive that. I don't know. There's elections coming up. So we'll see what happens. But Turkey is definitely a major player in the Syrian file. They were the first to embrace the Syrian opposition. They were first to embrace the Free Syrian Army. They were the first to reject Assad. And they have accepted 500,000 refugees that they have maintained for the last 3 years at great expense. And it's great conflict in that country, controversy in that country about what we're going to do with all these refugees, and et cetera, et cetera. So Turkey is very much caught in all of this.
Okay.
I just didn't have time to get into it. Yeah.
Okay, I was curious because, like the lady there, I've lived in Turkey. I've lived, as I told you earlier, as well in the Middle East, and I was in Oman for a long period of time during the Arab Spring. But my second question, then I'll have a seat, is Assad. I'm really wondering how he would have developed this notion that Israel wanted to attack him. Do you think perhaps it was during his studies? Was he maybe contacted? Is there any understanding or idea?
I mean, the average Syrian believes that they'll be attacked by Israel, that they would be attacked. During the last 30 years, there's always been this sense that Syria was vulnerable to Israeli attack. And that's very true in the sense that Israel's weapon capability was very, very, very much superior Israel's weapons capability was very much higher than Syria. Syria was still a Soviet bloc country. Most of their weapons and stuff came from the Soviet era, their tanks, all that kind of stuff, whereas Israel has continued to get U.S. equipment, new and improved, etc. So there's a massive discrepancy there, and Assad was very aware of it, both the father and the son. But the father played it a more careful game. He was pretty happy with what he had. He didn't want to challenge too much. He was still mad about the Golan, but he always believed that he could trade the Golan and get it back in some kind of peace treaty. That was always the father's plan and his thinking. Bashar never really cared that much about that. He wanted to find a way to actually create deterrence against Israel. And so part of that was the continuing propaganda against Israel and the anti-Semitism in the media, and all that was kept going and kept going. And also just he personally wanted to be the guy who was able to get something that would be a deterrence against Israeli attack. So yeah, that's that. So we'll stop at that and then go to Egypt.